Welcome. Let's dive right in because we're about to unravel a geopolitical chess game from early 2026 that is just fascinating. We're going to explore how a massive crisis in South America and a full-blown war in the Middle East, well, how they might not have been separate events at all, but actually two sides of the very same coin.
So here's the central question, right? Get this. On January 3, 2026, U.S. forces capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Then, just 56 days later, the U.S. and Israel launched this massive military operation against Iran. The timing, it just feels a little too perfect, doesn't it? So were these two monumental events just a wild coincidence?
Well, according to the analyses we're digging into, the answer is a hard no. This was no coincidence. In fact, they argue it was a single, meticulously calculated strategy, a coordinated timeline orchestrated by the United States.
And that brings us to the core idea of this whole explainer, what's being called the insurance policy theory. The argument is basically this. The U.S. had to secure Venezuelan oil first. It was a strategic prerequisite, an insurance policy, if you will, before it could ever risk starting a major war in the Persian Gulf.
So here's how we're going to connect all the dots. We'll start by looking at how these two crises were really one strategy. Then we'll get into the details of that Venezuelan insurance policy and how America's own energy situation played into it. From there, we'll see how the fuse was lit in the Middle East, the global crisis that erupted, and finally, what some are calling the new energy order. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Two Crises, One Strategy. Let's see how these sources really connect what was happening in South America with the Middle East. You know, the sequence of events here is absolutely critical. The move on Venezuela wasn't out of the blue. It came after a ton of pressure, including a complete blockade in late 2024. Then boom, Maduro's captured in early 2026. And it was only after Venezuela was locked down that Operation Epic Fury kicked off, just 56 days later. The timing is everything. Which brings us to Section 2, the Venezuelan insurance policy. So why? Why was this one South American nation the big strategic prize, the absolute key to the entire plan?
And the reason, well, it's just staggering. 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. That is the largest on the entire planet. We're talking more than Saudi Arabia. You know, our sources argue that control over this much oil is about way more than just gas prices. It's about raw geopolitical power.
But here's the paradox, right? Despite having all this oil, Venezuela's industry was an absolute wreck. Production had just collapsed, falling from a peak of 3.5 million barrels a day down to a measly 800,000. And that huge gap between potential and reality, well, that created a massive opportunity for an outside power to come in and turn the taps back on. And this is exactly why Venezuelan oil was such a perfect match for the United States. See, it's not just any oil. It's a specific kind, heavy, sour crude. And America's giant refineries on the Gulf Coast, they were specifically built to process that exact type of oil. The U.S. shale boom, on the other hand, produces a different, lighter kind of crude. It's not a substitute. So getting Venezuela's supply wasn't just about more oil, it was about feeding the perfect fuel into America's industrial engine, while also cutting off that same supply from a major rival, China.
Now for Section 3, America's energy freedom. This is the other half of the equation. Because while the U.S. was making moves on Venezuela, its own shale revolution had totally changed the game back home.
I mean, the transformation was incredible. As you can see, the U.S. went from pumping around 5 million barrels a day and being super dependent on imports to producing over 13 million barrels and becoming a net exporter. This flipped the script completely, making it way less vulnerable to global energy shocks. It went from a dependent buyer to a resilient global producer.
And this quote right here, it just nails the crucial point. This newfound strategic freedom was the real game changer. Think about it. Before, a war in the Middle East meant guaranteed pain at the pump for Americans. But with this huge domestic buffer, the U.S. could handle global price spikes, which gave it a broader range of policy options, including, as it turns out, starting a major conflict.
Okay, so with the Venezuelan insurance policy secured and that domestic shale buffer firmly in place, the stage was set. This brings us to Section 4, the Middle East flashpoint, where the U.S. was finally ready to roll out the second act of its grand plan.
The strategic logic as laid out in these sources breaks down into three pretty clear steps. First, you secure Venezuela, creating what analysts called a Western Hemisphere Energy Bridge. Second, with that bridge built, you initiate the conflict with Iran. And third, use your combined shale production and that new Venezuelan supply to absorb the energy shock that you know is coming, a shock that would absolutely cripple other countries.
And that energy shock was immediate, and it was severe, which leads us to Section 5, a world in crisis. Because while the U.S. was insulated, this whole strategic play had massive consequences for the rest of the world, which did not have America's unique energy advantages.
To really get why, you just have to look at this one spot on the map, the Strait of Hormuz. Something like 20% of all the world's oil and 20% of its natural gas flows through this tiny waterway. So when Operation Epic Fury started and traffic through there slowed to a crawl, it instantly put a stranglehold on a fifth of the world's entire energy supply.
The economic fallout was immediate and it was brutal. Oil prices just surged. Economies in Europe and Asia that depend on imports were thrown into crisis. But China, the world's biggest oil importer, got hit with a double whammy. Its supply line from Venezuela was gone, and its supply from Iran was now in the middle of a war zone. And all the while, U.S. energy companies were sitting pretty, poised for what analysts called windfall profits.
But these events didn't just cause some temporary crisis. No, they signaled the start of a whole new era, which brings us to our final section, Section 6, the new energy order.
So what was the primary long-term consequence? It was basically the death of the old system. The idea of a single, globalized energy market was, for all intents and purposes, over. And in its place, a new reality was born, a world of competing regional energy blocks, with the U.S. consolidating its control over the Western Hemisphere.
And according to these analyses, the strategy was brilliant because it served multiple U.S. goals all at once. I mean, securing its own energy supply was job one, of course. But it also weakened rivals like China and Russia by controlling energy flows, it propped up the petrodollar system, and ultimately it chipped away at the power of OPEC+.
And this all brings us to our final thought. You can look at the events of 2026 as this strategic masterstroke, right? Using energy to totally reshape the global order. But it also created a more fractured, more competitive world. So we're left with one last question. In this new era of regional energy competition, is any nation truly independent? Or is everyone just interdependent in new and maybe even more volatile ways?